Hi there. Welcome to lecture 2 in week 3, and we're going to talk about gender as a means of controlling labor. Something that we learned from the readings this week is that gender is a key means by which work is structured. This leads Marianne Cooper to draw on Qin Li and Joan Acker in saying that work is a gendered institution. Now, before we dive into that, I just want to introduce Marianne Cooper along with her influences, Qin Li and Joan Acker. Acker is a second-wave feminist and sociologist who wrote extensively about gender as a structure within organizations. Acker, along with Marxist theorists such as Braverman and Michael Burawoy, influenced Qin Li, who's a sociologist who uses ethnography to study labor in China. Now, her key contribution, one that Cooper leans on quite heavily, was that gender was a means of structuring work that serves as a means of controlling labor. Thus, factory regimes or workplace regimes are gendered institutions. This breaks with conventional labor process theory, so people influenced by the work of Marx, such as Braverman, but also Michael Burawoy. Insofar as those people all emphasize class over gender or other aspects of social position, such as ethnicity, race, or status. This brings us finally to Marianne Cooper, who's a contemporary sociologist of gender and labor, and she's a senior research scholar at Stanford University's VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. Stanford, just to note, is in Silicon Valley in the United States. She's also an affiliate at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. She was lead researcher for a book that was kind of popular a few years ago. It was a New York Times bestseller called Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. So that's a little bit of a background on some of the people who are doing some of the work that we're reading. And so really what this week is showing is that, all those techniques of controlling labor, of structuring work processes that we discussed last week, those are all really important, but so are these other aspects of social identity or social position, right? And you can extrapolate from that and say that, okay, these kind of processes that we're discussing this week are in interaction, right? Or they intersect with everything we read last week to really structure work. And these are the techniques that are at play in the workplace to this day. These two feminist scholars, Acker and Lee, were influential on Cooper's interpretation of her interview data in the study that I had you all read. All three argue that gender is crucial to understanding power and exploitation in the workplace. Now, I said that Cooper uses this term, gendered institution, and I said this comes from Acker by way of Qin Li. Now, this term, gendered institution, is to say that work is structured by gender. Now, we can say that, right? But what does that mean practically? Well, if you think about it, we've already come across information in this course that suggests as much. What information am I talking about? You might say, well, we didn't read about gender specifically. We didn't, well, you might have noticed in week 1, right? Way back in week 1. It's week 3 already, right? That we learned about how occupations tend to be segregated along gender lines, as well as like pay. There are pay discrepancies between genders, right? Sometimes people who work in one occupation will tend to be mostly male, other times mostly female. Now, this occupational segregation tends to coincide with conventional gender roles. For example, masculinity is associated with executive positions and high-status white-collar jobs, such as being a lawyer, or creative jobs in the service sector, like being an architect. Now, I just want to take a little aside, because there's something I noticed in reading your responses. The service sector, as I said in lecture and as it says in the book, right, encompasses both interactional kind of service work and hospitality and things like that, but also service providers like an architect or a lawyer. Those people work in the service industries, right? The service sector, what the book calls the service sector. And you'll notice that, right? Financial workers are service sector or tertiary sector workers. Anyway, so you have these people, being an architect or something like that it tends to be gendered male, as is, being a professional like a lawyer or a doctor. In contrast, being a nurse, a therapist, or a domestic worker is often associated with conventional takes on femininity, such as being caring, nurturing. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is natural or correct. I'm not claiming that one... Now, to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that this is natural or in any way correct, but what I'm saying is that we live in a world in which gender roles, especially conventional ones, are highly salient in understanding how people come to be oppressed by capitalism. So we have occupational segregation along lines of gender, and as we learned last time, along lines of race, that contribute to the exploitation of workers. Now, Cooper is going well beyond this to say that not only are occupations gendered, something she highlights quite clearly with the observation that most workers in Silicon Valley, and more broadly, just the tech sector in North America, they tend to be men. But in addition to this gender segregation, gender roles serve as a form of what she calls normative control over workers. Now remember, control in the labor process, going all the way back to Marx, we read, just last week, is a technique by which management or capitalists get what they want from workers. More often, they want more labor power for less money or no money. Cooper finds tech industry men working really hard. They're averaging 10-hour workdays. That's quite a lot. They're mostly salaried or paid by the day, so more hours doesn't result in more pay. It's not like they're getting more money, right? They just get a flat salary regardless, or a flat day rate regardless of how long that day is. This is often what salaried work means, and this is often what happens when you work in the kind of short-term contract jobs that are common in the tech industry. They willingly do this, or at least they seem to. To this, she asks, this is a classic question, the sociology of work. Like, why do they do that? Why do they work so hard if they're not getting any more out of it? Why would they do this? Well, the boss, doesn't seem to be going around telling people to do so, at least not explicitly. There's nothing in the bureaucratic rules that dictates this kind of behavior. They don't do the sort of work that lends itself to Tayloristic kind of organization of work or scientific management, right? This is knowledge work. This isn't sort of repetitive task-based work like what happened in like factories and stuff like that. So how are they controlled? What she finds is that, workers believe they should do this. They should put forth this kind of labor. This is why she calls it normative. Right? It's what they believe they ought to be doing. Right? In other words, the control mechanism by which capital extracts labor power is ideological. It's based on internalized beliefs. Now, this ideology doesn't stem necessarily from management. It comes from this sort of broader patriarchal world in which these workers find themselves. And this is, seen quite clearly in the sorts of social relations that are reproduced at home when the men that Cooper interviewed meet the gendered expectations of their jobs. The men who were most able to meet the expectation of their jobs, to always put work first, to put in as much work as possible at the expense of all else, those men tend to be the most traditional at home. Their wives cook, clean, and act as primary care providers for their children. Even the men who fall short of these expectations tend to still engage in actions that reproduce conventional gender roles, such as relying on female coworkers to understand and support them when the men need to take time off to fulfill their duties as fathers at home. So while the traditional men rely on their wives for everything outside the home, they don't do anything at home. I mean, can you imagine that? Transitional men and super dads expect women to perform additional care work or emotional labor to support them in the workplace. So again, gender structures work not just for women, but for men as well, right? Even an all-male workplace is not gender neutral. This is a key point made by Cooper. And it's something that I found to be very influential in my work because I study industries and workplaces that are populated mostly by men. So gender under capitalism seems to enable exploitation of both men and women. For women, it seems to justify low wages, exclusion from particular occupations based on assumptions on women's capabilities, incorrect often assumptions about women's capabilities, and heightened caregiving expectations at home and in the workplace. And for men, hegemonic masculinity certainly grants access to higher wages, but it also seems to goad men into providing excessive amounts of labor power. And this, while exploiting men, also puts more burdens upon women. To be a man or the go-to guy means to work excessively at the expense of all else. This is detrimental to men, but it also serves as a barrier for women who, because of conventional gender roles, are saddled with the burdens of caregiving for children, the elderly, or other relatives, and as we saw in the article, even caring for co-workers. Right? And so a lot of these expectations of the ideal worker are in fact associated with masculinity, making it doubly kind of difficult for women to enter these places. These normative beliefs about gender are really entrenched, as is a certain normalization of market society. As we learned in week 1, the world has not always had capitalism. There's been other modes of organizing the world. And, hopefully there will be something new to take its place. And, I think what's going on here in this reading from Cooper, you also see, she makes a comment on this, of how normalized it's become for these men to see themselves and their lives through the eyes of capitalists, to think in terms of what's best for their bosses rather than themselves or their families. And I got to wondering, how often do any of us think that way? How often do we side with bosses, with business owners, with capital over labor? How often do we willingly think of ourselves as commodities? Many of you brought up the new kind of work of, that goes on in social media. All these, profitable opportunities that happen online. And yet, this thing that I've noticed some of you look upon with wide eyes and hopeful expectations, it often requires us to think in terms of self-branding, which is something we'll read about later on in the term. And what is that language of self-branding other than the naturalization of capitalism, the naturalization of a market society, thinking of yourself as an object to be exchanged? Which begs the question, are we the puppets that pull our own strings? I think what's interesting here is that toward the end of the article, Cooper offers up an example of resistance in which men resist their gender role at great emotional cost. It takes a lot of effort to reevaluate how one performs or enacts a particular gender role, whether it's masculine or feminine, or non-binary even. And it takes a lot of effort for these men to kind of question their identity and kind of come up with a new way of understanding themselves that they can feel good about. So resistance, actually, it seems quite difficult because this isn't something that's being imposed upon us from without. It's something that we've internalized and it feels natural to us. And yet, as you can see, what feels natural, this way of being a man, right, serves to exploit them. Now, I wonder, this kind of resistance, this kind of, rethinking, reimagining of the self that Cooper describes, I wonder, is this sort of, it's hyper individualist, right? I wonder, is this sort of individual resistance available or to women or to those who are racialized, right? I won't pretend I don't have an answer to that. But my sense is that the answer requires further research. Research that attends to the intersections of race and gender at work, especially when it comes to resistance. Now, with this week, I hope to have given you kind of the tools by which you can think through those issues on your own, to think critically about things that are going on, that you might see in the news, or even in other classes. And with that, I'll sign off. See you next week when we're going to talk about technology in the body at work.